Ethan Mercer had never imagined that his life would lead him to a royal marriage. He was a soldier, not a prince, not a leader. But everything changed when the leaders of humanity and the alien Xynari people agreed to an unprecedented peace treaty. The treaty was fragile, and to seal it, the highest sacrifice was demanded: an arranged marriage between a human and the Xynari heir. That human was Ethan, and the alien princess he was to marry was Ryara, the future queen of the Xynari. The peace had come at a cost. Years of bloodshed and distrust between the two species had made every alliance a battlefield. When the proposal was made, Ethan had been chosen because of his military service, his reputation for loyalty, and his willingness to put the greater good before his own desires. But none of that prepared him for the reality of standing in front of Princess Ryara, the woman he was to marry for the sake of peace.
Ethan's first impression of her was one of awe.
She was breathtakingly beautiful, but not in the way that he was used to. Ryara's features were delicate, but sharp, like the edge of a blade. Her skin was a deep, almost iridescent blue, with markings that seemed to shimmer under the light. Her eyes, large and dark, held a power that could silence a room. She stood with the grace of a ruler, yet her eyes seemed distant, as if carrying the weight of the galaxy on her shoulders. The ceremony was held in the heart of the Xynari capital, a city unlike any Ethan had ever seen. Towering spires of metal and glass stretched high above, while the streets below buzzed with energy. The Xynari people, elegant and proud, gathered to witness the joining of their princess to a human soldier. It was a historic moment, one that would be remembered for centuries. The people expected this marriage to signify the beginning of a new era, where differences could be set aside for the greater good. As Ethan stood beside Ryara at the altar, he could feel the tension in the air. The whole galaxy was watching, waiting for them to make history. Ryara's gaze was steady, her expression unreadable. Ethan felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him, but he tried to push through it. He had promised to do his duty, to bring peace to a fractured universe. After the ceremony, the newlywed couple retreated to their private chambers. Ethan had expected a celebration, a chance to get to know his bride. But Ryara was distant. She moved through the room with quiet grace, preparing for their first night together as husband and wife. But there was no warmth in her actions. Ethan couldn't help but wonder as she saw him as just a tool in her mission, a means to an end. "I suppose this is what we've been waiting for," Ethan said, trying to break the ice as he sat on the edge of the bed. Ryara didn't answer immediately. Instead, she gazed out of the window, her eyes fixed on the stars beyond the palace walls. Ethan couldn't help but admire her, but the silence between them made the distance feel even greater. They had just pledged their lives to one another in front of millions, yet here they were, two strangers in the same room.
"It's not just about us," Ryara said quietly, her voice soft yet full of authority. "It's about what comes next."
"What we represent." Ethan nodded, understanding.
They were more than just a married couple. They were symbols of peace, of the possibility of a future without war. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized that it was hard to feel close to someone when you were only bound by duty. He had spent so many years fighting in wars, following orders, and now he was expected to follow this one. But the human side of him still yearned for something more. As the night wore on, Ethan tried to talk to Ryara, to ask her about her world, her people. He wanted to know more about her, about what had shaped her into the person she was today. But every time he spoke, Ryara's responses were curt, her eyes always wandering off, as though she were lost in thought. It was as if she was somewhere else, somewhere far beyond the palace. Ethan lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, trying to make sense of his feelings. He had entered this marriage with the understanding that it was for the good of the galaxy. But as he lay there next to his new wife, he felt more alone than he ever had before. The silence between them was deafening, and Ethan began to wonder if this was what he had truly signed up for. He wasn't sure if Ryara had any intention of making this marriage work beyond the surface. There was a coldness in her eyes, a wall she kept up between them. It wasn't just that she was a princess. It was as though she had already given up on the idea of love, on the idea of building a life with someone. And yet, Ethan couldn't help but feel that there was more to her than she was letting on. He just didn't know how to break through that wall, how to make her see him as more than just a political pawn. As the night dragged on, Ethan drifted into an uneasy sleep, wondering what the future held for them both. He had made a vow to stand by Ryara's side, to help bring peace to the galaxy. But he hadn't expected to feel so disconnected from the person he was supposed to be closest to. He hadn't expected to feel so far from her, despite the physical closeness between them. Tomorrow would be a new day. Ethan hoped that somehow they could find a way to bridge the gap between them. But as he lay there in the dark, he couldn't shake the feeling that the road ahead would not be as simple as he had hoped. The days following the marriage were quiet and uneventful. Ethan had expected excitement, perhaps even some celebration. But instead, he was met with silence. Briara, the Zanari princess who had become his wife for the sake of peace, remained as distant as ever. She greeted him with a formal smile each morning and retired to her private chambers each night without a word. They shared meals, but the conversations were always brief, and her mind seemed to be elsewhere, as if she were constantly preoccupied with something that Ethan couldn't understand. It wasn't that Ryara was cold or unkind. No, she was always polite, always respectful. But there was a distance in her eyes, a barrier that seemed impossible to cross. She spoke of politics, of the responsibilities of being the future queen, but there was never a personal touch to her words. Ethan had come to realize that he was a mere figure in her life, a political necessity more than a partner. He wasn't sure if it was the weight of her role or something deeper that kept her from truly connecting with him. Perhaps, he thought, it was because she had been raised in a world so different from his own, a world where duty and tradition came before everything else. Ethan tried, day after day, to break through that wall. He asked her about her life, her childhood, the things that made her who she was. He told her about Earth, about the culture he had grown up in, hoping that they might find some common ground. But every attempt seemed to fall flat. Riara would smile politely, nod, and then shift the conversation back to politics or the affairs of the galaxy. She spoke of peace negotiations and the future of her people, but there was no mention of what they might build together as husband and wife. One evening, as they sat together in the palace's grand hall, Ethan found himself watching her. She was as graceful as ever, her movements fluid and deliberate. But there was something about her demeanor that seemed off, something that made her seem more like a ruler than a wife. She didn't look at him the way he thought a wife should look at her husband. There was no warmth in her gaze, no affection, just the cold, distant look of someone who had been raised to lead, not to love. Ethan sighed, running a hand through his hair. He had been trying so hard, but it felt as if Ryara didn't even want to try. The thought made his chest tighten with frustration. He wasn't sure what he had expected when he agreed to this marriage, but he had certainly hoped for more than this. He had hoped for companionship, for a partnership that went beyond the ceremonial. He had hoped that, perhaps, over time, they might come to care for each other. But so far, there had been no sign of that. Only silence. "Ryara," he said quietly, breaking the stillness between them. She looked up, her dark eyes meeting his, but there was no change in her expression. "I know this isn't easy. I know we're not in control of our situation, but we're married now. We're partners in this. I don't want to be a stranger to you." Her gaze softened for a moment, but she quickly regained her composure. "I understand, Ethan, but you must understand as well that this marriage is not about us. It's about peace, about uniting our people for the greater good. It is not a union born of love, but of necessity, and for that reason, I have to remain focused on my duty. I cannot afford to let emotions cloud my judgment." Her words hit Ethan like a cold wave. He had known that the marriage was for political reasons, but hearing her say it so plainly, without any hint of personal connection, made him feel even more alone. He didn't know what he had expected, but it certainly wasn't this. Ryara had made it clear that this was not a marriage based on love, and perhaps that was all it could ever be. But Ethan still hoped. Maybe he was fooling himself, but he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to her than what she was letting on. Days turned into weeks, and still, things remained the same. He found that he enjoyed the time away from Ryara, even though it left him feeling more distant from her. The people of the Zenari capital greeted him with respect, and he had started to learn more about their culture, their history, and their way of life. But none of it seemed to fill the emptiness that had begun to grow inside him. He missed the connection he had once hoped for, the closeness that came with a true marriage, not one built solely on duty. One evening, as he walked through the palace gardens, Ethan found himself lost in thought. The flowers in the garden were unlike anything he had ever seen, their colors vivid and strange, glowing in the dim light of the twin moons overhead. The peaceful atmosphere was soothing, but his mind was far from calm. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. The peace that had been promised between their two worlds was fragile, yes, but he couldn't help but feel that the marriage itself was just as fragile. He wasn't sure how long he could continue to live in this tension, this strange limbo between duty and desire. He wanted more than what they had. He wanted to feel close to Ryara, to understand her in a way that no one else could. As he stood there, staring up at the stars, he heard footsteps approaching from behind. He turned to see Ryara walking toward him, her silhouette outlined against the glowing garden. She didn't speak immediately, but her presence was enough to make Ethan's heart race. "Ethan!" she said, her voice soft but firm.
"I know this marriage has been difficult for you, and I know I have not made it easy."
"But there is something you must understand." She paused, her gaze steady as she looked him in the eye. "This is not just about us. It is about the future of both our people. The peace we are building is fragile, and it requires sacrifices from both sides. I have given much for this peace, and I ask you to do the same." Ethan's chest tightened as he heard the weight of her words. He had always known that there were sacrifices to be made, but hearing her speak about it so directly made the reality of their situation even clearer. They were not just partners, they were symbols, walking a fine line between two worlds. He couldn't help but wonder if they would ever be able to step off that line and into something more, something real. "I understand," Ethan said, his voice quiet but steady. "But I can't help but feel that there's more to this than just duty. I'm trying, Ryara. I'm trying to make this work." She looked at him for a moment longer, then nodded slowly.
I know you are, and I appreciate your efforts.
"But we cannot forget the bigger picture." Ethan nodded, though he couldn't help but feel the distance between them grow even wider. Perhaps, he thought, this was all they could ever be. Partners in a political arrangement. Bound by duty, but not by love. As the night wore on, Ethan stood in the garden, staring up at the stars. The silence between him and Ryara was deafening, and for the first time, he wondered if he would ever find a way to bridge the gap that had formed between them. The weeks passed in a quiet blur for Ethan. His life had become a routine of diplomatic meetings, long hours spent in the palace library, and quiet dinners with Ryara that seemed to grow colder with each passing day.
It had been almost 2 months since their marriage, but it felt like they were still strangers.
Every day he tried harder to understand her, but she remained distant, always focused on the political responsibilities that came with her role as the future queen of the Zenari. Ethan had learned a great deal about the Zenari people, their culture, and their history. He had even come to admire Ryara's strength and intelligence. She was a leader, no doubt about it. But that admiration didn't fill the void that had started to grow inside him. He had married for peace, yes, but he had hoped that there would be more. He had hoped that, at the very least, they might become friends, maybe even partners in the truest sense of the word. Instead, He felt as if he was drifting further away from her with every passing day. One evening, after another quiet dinner in the palace, Ryara surprised him. Instead of retreating to her chambers as she usually did, she motioned for him to follow her. Ethan hesitated, unsure of what to expect, but he followed her down a narrow hallway, past the servants' quarters, and into a small, private room at the back of the palace. The room was simple, with a low table in the center and a few cushions scattered around the floor. A small window overlooked the city, offering a view of the distant mountains. Ryara stood by the window, her back to him, her posture rigid. She didn't speak at first, but Ethan could tell that something was on her mind. "What is this place?" Ethan asked quietly, unsure of why they were here. "It's a place where I can think," Ryara replied, her voice low and distant. "A place where I can be alone." Ethan nodded, but didn't say anything. He wasn't sure what to do or say. They had spent so much time together in public, in front of their people, that he had forgotten what it felt like to simply talk to her, without the weight of expectation hanging over them. After a long silence, Ryara turned to face him. "I've been avoiding you," she said, her eyes downcast. "And I know it. I've been pushing you away, and I don't know how to explain why." Ethan felt a wave of relief wash over him. At least she was acknowledging it.
"I've felt that too,"
he said quietly. "I don't know what's happening between us, but I don't want to be a stranger to you." Ryara's eyes met his, and for the first time, Ethan saw a flicker of vulnerability in her expression. "It's not you," she said softly. "It's me. I've always been taught to put duty before everything else, even before my own feelings. And I've been struggling with that, with you. You're not just my husband, Ethan. You're the key to a future that has been planned for us, a future I didn't choose. And I don't know how to be anything else." Ethan felt a pang of sympathy for her. He had known that their marriage wasn't about love, but hearing her speak of it so plainly made him realize just how difficult it must be for her. She had been raised to be a queen, to lead her people with strength and determination, not to care about things like love or companionship. He had been foolish to think that she could easily make the transition from duty to partnership. "I didn't choose this marriage either," Ethan said, his voice soft but steady. "I didn't choose to be here, but I'm here. And I'm trying, Ryara. I'm trying to understand you, to be here for you, even if it's hard. But I can't do this alone. If you want this marriage to work, if you want us to work, then we have to meet halfway." Ryara's expression softened, and she took a small step toward him. "I know. I just don't know how." Ethan reached out and gently took her hand, feeling the coolness of her skin against his. "We take it, one step at a time. We don't have to have all the answers right now, but we have to start somewhere." For the first time in a long while, Ryara didn't pull away. Instead, she looked down at their joined hands, and then back up at him. "I've been afraid," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "Afraid of what this marriage means, afraid of what it will do to my people, and afraid of what it will do to me." Ethan squeezed her hand gently. "You don't have to carry all of that alone. You're not alone in this, Ryara. We're in this together, and we'll figure it out." There was a long pause before Ryara spoke again. "There's something I need to tell you," she said quietly. "Something I've kept hidden from you, and from everyone." Ethan felt a wave of confusion. "What is it?" Ryara took a deep breath, as if gathering the strength to speak. "I can't have children," she said, her voice trembling. "I've known this for a long time, but I didn't want to tell you. I didn't want you to see me differently. I didn't want you to see me as weak or less than a queen should be." The words hung in the air, heavy and full of meaning. Ethan's mind raced as he processed what she had just said. He had never expected this, had never considered it. The marriage, the union between their peoples, had always been about creating a future together. But now, with Ryara's admission, everything seemed uncertain.
I don't understand, Ethan said, his voice low.
Why didn't you tell me sooner? I didn't want to disappoint you, Ryara replied softly. I know that our marriage was supposed to be more than just a political alliance. It was supposed to represent hope, a new beginning. But how can I give you a future when I can't give you children? How can I lead a people who expect me to produce an heir when I can't do that? Ethan was silent for a moment, trying to process her words. It was a revelation that shook him to his core, but at the same time, he felt an overwhelming sense of compassion for her. He had no idea what it felt like to be in her position, to carry the weight of such a secret, such a burden. But one thing was clear to him. This didn't change how he felt about her.
You don't have to give me children to make this marriage work, Ethan said firmly. That's not what this is about.
You don't have to prove anything to me. You've already given so much, Ryara.
You've given your people everything, and you've carried the weight of your responsibility with grace. That's more than enough.
Ryara's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't look away. I'm sorry, she whispered. I'm so sorry. Ethan pulled her into a gentle embrace, holding her close as she finally allowed herself to break down. He didn't have all the answers, and he didn't know what the future held for them. But in that moment, he knew one thing for sure. They would face whatever came next together. The days after their conversation were difficult, but something in the air had shifted between them. The walls that Ryara had built around herself had started to crack, and for the first time, Ethan felt a glimmer of hope. It wasn't much, but it was something. They began spending more time together, not just in the palace, but in the quiet corners of their world where no one else could see them. Slowly, very slowly, they started to talk, really talk, about things other than duty, about their hopes and fears, and about the future. Ethan could see the change in Ryara. She was still the powerful, regal princess, but there was a softness in her now, a vulnerability she hadn't shown before. And though she remained focused on her responsibilities, she was no longer shutting him out completely. She was starting to share more of herself with him, even if it was in small doses. One afternoon, as they walked through the palace gardens, Ryara stopped in front of a large fountain. The water sparkled in the sunlight, casting a soft glow over everything around them. It was a peaceful moment, and for the first time in weeks, it felt like they were just two people, not a queen and a soldier, not symbols of peace, but simply two souls in a quiet space.
I've been thinking, Ryara said quietly, her voice soft but steady.
Ethan glanced at her, waiting for her to continue.
About what? About the future, she said, turning to face him. About what comes next.
For us, for our people, for this marriage.
Ethan nodded, unsure of where she was going with this.
But he was willing to listen.
What do you think comes next?
He asked. Ryara's eyes met his, and for a moment, she looked almost lost, as if she didn't have all the answers, as if she were searching for something in his face that might help her find her way.
I don't know, she admitted.
I thought I knew what my life was supposed to be. I thought I understood my role in all of this.
But now, I'm not sure. Ethan stepped closer to her, the distance between them shrinking in the quiet of the moment. It's okay not to know, he said gently. We don't have to have all the answers right now. We just have to keep moving forward. Together. Ryara looked at him for a long moment, and then she nodded. A small but meaningful gesture. Together, she whispered, as if the word held more weight than it ever had before. It was a new beginning, though neither of them knew exactly what that would look like. They had come into this marriage as strangers, as two people who had been thrown together by circumstances beyond their control. And though they had begun to understand each other better, there was still so much to learn, so much to discover about one another. But for the first time, Ethan didn't feel like he was carrying the weight of the universe on his shoulders alone. They were partners now, not just in name, but in truth. In the days that followed, Ethan and Riara began to carve out time for each other in their busy schedules. They would sit together in the palace, discussing matters of state, yes, but also talking about their pasts, their hopes for the future, and what they wanted from their marriage. It wasn't perfect, and it certainly wasn't easy, but it was real. And that was something that neither of them had expected when they first entered into this arrangement. Riara's honesty about her infertility had shaken Ethan, but it had also opened up a deeper connection between them. She had feared that it would push him away, but instead, it had made him see her in a new light. He no longer saw her as just a queen, just a political figure. He saw her as a person, a woman who had sacrificed so much for the sake of her people. He saw her strength, her vulnerability, and her humanity in a way that he hadn't before. As they grew closer, they began to discuss their future in ways that went beyond the political realm. They spoke of children, not in the traditional sense, but in a broader sense. Perhaps they would adopt, perhaps they would find other ways to create a family. They didn't have all the answers, but they knew they would face whatever came next, together. And then, one day, the galaxy that had once seemed so distant and foreign suddenly felt smaller. The peace they had worked so hard to build was beginning to take root, but there were still challenges to face. Riara's role as the future queen was never far from her mind, and the weight of leadership always seemed to hover above them. But there was something different now, something that gave Ethan hope. It was the knowledge that, no matter what happened, they were in this together. They had each other, and that was something they hadn't had before. One evening, after another long day of meetings, Riara invited Ethan to the royal gardens once again. This time, they sat beneath the stars, the soft glow of the palace lights casting shadows around them. It was a moment of quiet, a rare chance to simply be. "I've been thinking," Riara said, her voice barely a whisper in the stillness.
About what you said. About family.
Ethan turned to face her, his heart racing a little.
What did I say? About how we don't have to have children in the way that others expect, she said. That we can create a family in our own way. Ethan smiled, a warm, genuine smile that reached his eyes.
Yeah, we don't have to follow anyone's rules but our own.
Riara took a deep breath, as if something inside her was shifting. "I want that," she said softly. "I want to build something real, something that belongs to us. Not just to my people, not just to your people, but to us." Ethan reached out and took her hand, squeezing it gently. "We'll figure it out," he said, his voice full of certainty. "Together." For the first time since their marriage began, Ethan felt like he was standing on solid ground. They didn't know what the future held, but they were ready to face it. Together, they would build a life, a family, in their own way. And that was enough. The peace between their peoples was fragile, yes, but it was also stronger than it had ever been. And in their hearts, Ethan and Riara knew that the true strength of their marriage lay not in what they could give to the galaxy, but in what they could give to each other. They were no longer just a symbol. They were partners, friends, and something more. They were a family, and together they would face whatever challenges the future brought. As they sat together in the garden, the stars above them shining bright, Ethan knew that this was just the beginning of their journey. It wouldn't be easy, but it would be worth it. And for the first time, he felt like the future was something they could build together, one step at a time.